Welcome back to PoliSci Philes, your
Yeah.
go-to for all things political science. Today, we're diving deep into the mind of Vladimir Putin. I think everyone knows him, but he's often called as Enigma, right? And we're going to try to really unpack his whole ideology. And we're using Michelle Elchaninov's book, Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin, as our guide.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating read. It really helps to kind of make sense of how all of his action, on the world stage, how they stem from this really deeply rooted set of beliefs that he has.
Okay, so the book takes us on a chronological journey. Starts with his early life and his Soviet roots. So would you say that his Soviet experience was the biggest factor in shaping his ideology?
I mean, it's definitely foundation. Elchaninov calls him a fundamental Soviet because even though he's not a communist ideologue, he still embodies all of those core Soviet values, patriotism, militarism, sense of historical mission for Russia.
Yeah.
And on page 22, Elchaninov even quotes Putin saying that he misses the Soviet Union.
He misses it. That's pretty striking for a guy who's been in power for over 2 decades after its collapse.
Right. But he clarifies that he doesn't want it back.
Okay.
What he misses and what really irks him is the way that the Soviet Union collapsed. He sees it as a geopolitical catastrophe, and these are his words, not mine, primarily because of the perceived humiliation that Russia suffered, this sense of national humiliation,
Right.
of Russia being diminished on the world stage. I mean, that is a huge driving force for him.
Yeah.
It's why he's trying to reassert Russian power and influence today,
Yeah. So he's got this deep-seated resentment towards the West for, what he perceives as their role in the Soviet collapse.
Uh-huh.
But Elchaninov also talks about how Putin's time in the KGB shaped his worldview as well.
Absolutely. Putin sees the KGB, not the Communist Party, as the true defenders of national interests. And the KGB instilled in him this sense of suspicion towards the West, this idea that they're always trying to undermine Russia. And on page 17, Elchaninov writes, "For Putin, the West was not so much an ideological adversary as a hostile foreign power, driven by its own interests and intent on weakening Russia."
Wow. So that really explains his almost instinctive distrust of the West.
Yeah.
It's not just political, it's deeply personal.
It runs deep. And it's important to understand this because it explains why he's so resistant to Western ideas of democracy and liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
He sees them as threats, as tools for undermining Russian sovereignty.
Right. And this also ties into his rehabilitation of figures like Stalin, right?
Yes. Putin doesn't necessarily endorse everything Stalin did, but he sees Stalin as a symbol of Russian strength, someone who stood up to the West. And rehabilitating Stalin is a way for Putin to reclaim national pride, to project an image of Russia as a powerful force to be reckoned with,
So we're starting to see a pattern here, a deep-seated resentment towards the West, a suspicion of Western intentions, a yearning for a return to Russian greatness. But then in the early 2000s, Putin initially presented himself as a pro-Western reformer.
He did. He even quoted Kant, a key figure in Enlightenment thought, to position himself as a leader who was aligned with Western values. It was a bit of a head scratcher for many observers.
Definitely seems like a shift from everything we've just discussed about his Soviet roots, KGB background.
Yeah.
Was he just trying to play the West? What was going on there?
Well, Elchaninov explores this in the chapter titled Feigned Liberalism. And he points out that Putin, while he adopted some of this liberal rhetoric, was simultaneously cracking down on media freedom and consolidating his power.
So it sounds like he was talking the talk, but not walking the walk.
Exactly. On page 37, Elchaninov quotes Andrei Ilarinov, Putin's former economic advisor, and Ilarinov called Putin's early liberalism a facade, pointing to the brutal Chechen war and the crackdown on independent media as evidence. He even argued that Putin was deliberately using liberal rhetoric to lull the West into a false sense of security.
That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
Was Ilarinov just a disgruntled ex-employee, or was there something to his accusation?
Well, Ilarinov's critique is significant because it raises questions about Putin's sincerity, about whether he was ever truly committed to liberal reforms.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, this was a time when Russia was still struggling to find its footing after the Soviet collapse.
Right.
Putin needed Western support, both economic and political, to stabilize the country.
So maybe presenting himself as a pro-Western reformer was like a strategic move to gain that support.
Right.
It's fascinating to think about, like, what his true intentions were during those early years.
Absolutely. And this tension between Putin's words and actions, between his stated commitment to Western values and his increasingly authoritarian tendencies, this is something that we'll see play out throughout his entire time in power.
We're definitely going to have to unpack that further, but we're just about out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Yeah. So this is where we really see Putin, like, solidifying his vision, for Russia and its place in the world. Remember, he spent the early 2000s playing this balancing act, like trying to portray himself as a reformer while he's also consolidating his power.
Right.
But after he returns to the presidency in 2012, his conservatism becomes much more like overt and assertive.
So what triggered this shift? Was it like a calculated move, or was there something else going on?
It's probably like a mix of factors, On a personal level, Putin seems genuinely anxious about the rapid pace of social and technological change. He sees these changes as threats to traditional values and social cohesion, particularly in Russia, which has always been wary of Western influence.
Right. And Elchaninov highlights Putin's focus on the family, on traditional gender roles and the Orthodox Church. Like, those are cornerstones of Russian identity for him.
Exactly. He sees these traditional institutions as like bulwarks against the perceived decadence and individualism of the West. On page 61, Elchaninov writes, Putin considers that Russia is the bearer of traditional values, which are opposed to the moral relativism he attributes to the West.
It's like he's drawing a line in the sand saying, this is what Russia stands for, and we're not going to compromise.
Right. And this conservative turn isn't just about, like, social values. It also extends to his approach to governance. Putin becomes increasingly skeptical of the internet and modern technology, seeing them as tools for Western meddling and social destabilization. He's particularly concerned about the potential for online platforms to spread dissent and undermine his authority.
So it's about control, like controlling the flow of information, controlling the narrative, controlling the way people think.
Control is definitely a key theme here, and this is where we see Putin drawing inspiration from a fascinating and perhaps somewhat troubling set of thinkers.
Okay.
Elchaninov dedicates a whole chapter to this, the thinkers of Putinism.
Okay, so who are these, like, intellectual architects of Putin's worldview?
One of the most influential figures is Ivan Ilyin,
Okay.
a previously obscure Russian philosopher who was exiled by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s.
Ilyin seems like an odd choice for a former KGB agent to embrace. I mean, wasn't he a staunch anti-communist?
He was. But what's interesting about Ilyin is that he was also deeply critical of Western-style democracy. He believed that true democracy, what he called genuine democracy, required a strong authoritarian leader who embodies the will of the people.
So not exactly the kind of democracy we're used to in the West.
Not at all. Ilyin's vision of democracy is one where the leader is essentially above the law, acting as a benevolent dictator guided by a higher moral purpose. And this idea resonated with Putin, who was, looking for ways to justify his own increasingly authoritarian grip on power.
Yeah. And Elchaninov suggests that Putin was introduced to Ilyin's work by Nikita Mikhalkov, the famous Russian filmmaker.
Yes, Mikhalkov, who is known for his nationalist and conservative views, seems to have played a key role in shaping Putin's ideological worldview. He's a fascinating character in his own right, a sort of cultural ambassador for Putinism.
So we got Ilyin providing the philosophical framework for a strong authoritarian leader.
Yeah.
Who else is influencing Putin during this conservative turn?
Well, Elchaninov also points to Konstantin Leontiev, a 19th century philosopher who was known for his eccentric and deeply conservative views. Leontiev believed that societies go through cycles of growth and decay, and that strong leadership is necessary to prevent decline and maintain order.
Again, we see this emphasis on strong leadership and the rejection of liberal values.
Yes, and it's not just Russian thinkers who are influencing Putin. He's also drawn to the work of Carl Schmitt, a German legal theorist known for his dark and cynical view of politics.
I remember reading about Schmitt in my political theory class. Wasn't he associated with a Nazi?
He was, which makes his appeal to Putin even more intriguing. Schmitt's key idea is that politics is fundamentally about the distinction between friend and enemy. He believed that liberal democracies, with their emphasis on consensus and compromise, are ill-equipped to deal with existential threats.
So Putin, through Schmidt, is justifying a more adversarial approach to politics, a worldview that sees the world in terms of us versus them.
Exactly. Schmidt's ideas provide a sort of intellectual justification for Putin's confrontational stance towards the West, his willingness to use force to achieve his goals.
It's striking how he's weaving together these different strands of thought, from Russian conservatism to German legal theory, to create a coherent, albeit somewhat unsettling, worldview.
It's a potent mix, and it's important to understand these intellectual influences because they help explain, why Putin acts the way he does. But this is just one layer of his ideology. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Putin draws on ideas like the Russian way and Eurasianism to legitimize his vision of a resurgent Russia challenging the West.
Oh.
So we've talked about, his Soviet roots, his conservative turn, and his embrace of these thinkers like Ilyin and Schmidt.
Right.
But what does this actually look like, in practice? How does it shape his vision for Russia and its place in the world?
Yeah, that's the question Elchaninoff tackles in like the final chapters of the book. He argues that all of these ideological threads kind of converge in what he calls Putin's empire.
And this empire isn't just about territorial expansion, though we definitely see that in his actions in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine, right?
Right.
It's also about projecting power, influence, even a certain set of values.
Elchaninoff specifically mentions this concept of Novorossiya. It's a historical term for a region encompassing parts of Ukraine. And Putin has invoked this term to justify his annexation of Crimea and his support for separatists in eastern Ukraine.
Right. It's a way of reclaiming what he sees as historically Russian lands, kind of redrawing the geopolitical map with Russia at the center. But what's fascinating is that the model for this empire isn't entirely clear-cut.
Right, because it's not simply about ethnicity or language. Putin's vision seems to draw on a mix of cultural, historical, and religious ties.
Elchaninoff explores different potential models: Pan-Slavism, Orthodoxy, even a kind of economic union based on the ruble. But he concludes that none of these fully captures Putin's vision. It's more complex than that.
It's like he's drawing from all these different sources to create this kind of ideological justification for his actions. But ultimately, isn't it about power? About reasserting Russian dominance?
Yeah. Elchaninoff doesn't shy away from that conclusion. He quotes experts like Nikolai Mitrokhin and Andrei Larionov who argue that Putin's imperialism is primarily driven by a desire for power and control. It's about restoring Russia to what he sees as its rightful place in the world stage.
And this ambition extends beyond the former Soviet republics.
Yeah.
Elchaninoff talks about Putin's ideology for the world, his vision for a global order where Russia is a major player.
Exactly. This is where the concept of the Russian world or Ruski mir comes into play. It's an idea that's been gaining traction in Russian political circles, and it essentially encompasses the promotion of Russian language and culture, support for Russian speakers abroad, and the projection of Russia as a global moral leader.
So it's not just about hard power, about military might. It's also about soft power, about shaping perceptions and building influence through cultural and ideological means.
Precisely. And Putin is using a variety of tools to achieve this goal. He's poured resources into state-funded media outlets like Russia Today and Sputnik, which promote a pro-Kremlin worldview and challenge Western narratives. He's also cultivated ties with far-right movements in Europe and elsewhere, seeing them as natural allies in his fight against liberalism and globalism.
It's a pretty comprehensive strategy, and it's been surprisingly effective in some ways. He's managed to exploit divisions within the West, playing on fears about immigration, economic anxieties, and the erosion of traditional values.
And by presenting Russia as a defender of those values, as a bulwark against the perceived chaos and decadence of the West, he's been able to attract a certain following, both inside and outside of Russia.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. So where does this leave us? What does Elchaninov's exploration of Putin's mind tell us about the future?
Well, he doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does leave us with some pretty provocative questions. He suggests that we're entering a new era of great power competition where Russia is actively challenging the existing world order.
And this challenge isn't just about, military might or economic clout. It's also about ideas, about competing visions for the future.
Absolutely. Putin has managed to construct a compelling, albeit dangerous, narrative about Russia's special destiny, its spiritual mission, its role as a defender of traditional values. And that narrative resonates with a lot of people, both in Russia and beyond.
It's a lot to unpack, and Elchaninov's book offers a fascinating and insightful guide to understanding the mind of this enigmatic leader. So if you're interested in delving deeper into the forces shaping global politics today, I highly recommend checking it out. And be sure to subscribe to PoliSci Philes for more explorations into the world of political science. Until next time.